right. We're reviewing tonight, so we're not actually in any particular text to pick up with. So we're going to go through where we've been. We've closed out 3 of the 4 sections of this book. And so, apologize, I was back there. I plain forgot that I didn't update the PowerPoint, and so I had to go re-download it, the new one. So what we'll try to do is we're going to look first at just the general outline we're following, and then look at a more detailed structuring of it, and then look more thematically at what's going on, and then close out by asking ourselves the question why this matters. So first of all, let's begin by looking. This is the outline that we are following. In 1 Kings, of course, 1 and 2 Kings were originally one book, and so we're studying them that way. And so we're looking at the reign of Solomon in 1 Kings 1 through 11, and then the kingdom divides. That takes place in chapter 12, but it is solidified through chapter 16. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we've gotten into this kings versus prophets. That's 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 8. It just says 17 through 8, but it's 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 8. That's the section we just finished, where it's basically Elijah and Elisha versus the house of Ahab and that particular dynasty. And then the section we'll be going into in a couple weeks is the road to exile, because things are going to pick up steam quite quickly. All right, let's pay attention now to Solomon's reign, and we'll just walk through these chapter by chapter. So first of all, he's David's successor. In chapter 1, we go all the way back and remember that David has not chosen a successor. And so Adonijah tries to usurp the throne and become the king. But God ends up, David ends up picking Solomon. And so Adonijah is declared king, but then Solomon rides in. He's declared king by his small group, and then Solomon rides in on David's horse and is chosen to be the next king. And there's the potential here of another disaster, kind of like the Absalom incident. Whenever you change kings, it's always a turbulent time in kingdoms. And so Solomon is chosen as David's successor. Then in chapter 2, he really secures the kingdom. Okay, he's selected in 1, but in chapter 2, he secures it. David dies in the opening verses of that chapter. And then before David dies, he gives his son advice about what he should do concerning certain people. Some that have given David trouble, some that could potentially give him trouble as king. And so what he does, and he does not do it unjustly. You have to remember, we talked about that he's the king. And so a number of people, when they study 1 Kings chapter 2, they try to say that Solomon was unjust in what he was doing. He was just killing these people to secure himself. I'm not saying that kings didn't do that. I'm saying I don't think Solomon did that. He was the chief law enforcement officer, and the people were threatening the unity of the nation. He had an obligation, not just a personal vendetta, but an obligation to make sure that people who were threatening to disrupt the nation paid the penalty for it. And so I don't necessarily see it as anything underhanded. So he secures it. And then in chapter 3, you remember that's where God appears to him and tells him he'll give him anything that he requests, and he asks for wisdom. And as we said, Solomon is probably in his early 20s when he becomes king. And that's a daunting task, and he felt the weight of that task. I look at it now, and I just look in the sports world, and I see Sean McVay, who's the head coach of the Rams. He's 36 years old. He's a year older than I am, and he's running a major NFL program. There's no way possible I could do that. So it's amazing what capabilities exist, and he was a lot younger than that when he was hired, about 30. But it's amazing capability that exists, but you can feel overwhelmed by it. And Solomon said, this is just a huge task. I need wisdom, because to be frank, I really don't know what I'm doing. I mean, you can observe, you can see, you can learn, but until you're actually in the shoes and it's your decision to make at that point, it's just a different world. And so he asks for wisdom, and God gives that to him. And you remember God says, I'm actually going to give you the other things for which you did not ask. because you asked for a thing that was pleasing. So then when we move to chapter 4, his prosperity begins to take off. His wealth starts to accumulate a little bit. And then in chapter 5, his administrative abilities are really seen, the way he organizes. Now, I'm an organizational nerd, so that I really like. It's amazing to see God's emphasis on organization, by the way. You study the opening chapter of Numbers, the way he organized them is nothing shy of brilliant. It's nothing shy of it. And he is able. So what you need are different types of leaders at different moments. Okay? After Saul, what Israel needed was a king who could go to war and win. They needed a king that could make them safe, that could secure their borders. But what they needed by the time David was done was not someone who could go to war and win wars, because those had already been won. What they needed was an administrator, one that could organize the newly founded kingdom and really get it operating in the right direction. Because a lot of things happen with a lack, or a lot of things fall through the cracks, and a lot of bad things happen because of a lack of organization. And that happens at every level, from the personal level to the highest and most complex level. And so Solomon becomes that solid administrator who helps really elevate the kingdom to a new level. Then in chapters 6 and 7, he begins the process of building the temple, and also briefly mentions the building of his personal palace, which takes almost twice as long to build than the temple itself. Then in chapter 8, through a little bit of chapter 9, he has the prayer, the dedication service for the temple as an extended prayer on their behalf, and which is informative for a lot of things that follow in the rest of the Old Testament. Then in chapter 9, verse 10, all the way through the end of chapter 10, there's just a summary of his greatness. Whereas in chapter 4, we see his prosperity begin to take off. In chapter 10, we see it full-blown. Chapter 4, he's a young king, and he's starting to build some stuff, starting to build some wealth. By chapter 10, he has more than he even probably knows he has. It is that far out of control. He is a multi-billionaire / maybe getting close to a trillionaire when you look at land holdings and the weight of gold that he took in every year and all those different things. So he's become a great man. And just like that, then he falls flat on his face. He falls flat on his face. When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart from God, and he began to build houses or build temples to the gods of his wives. And so the greatest king that Israel had ever seen up to that point fell flat on his face toward the end of his life. And that's an important lesson at so many different levels. I don't ever reach a point in my life where I just coast now. Okay? That somehow the 40 years of faithfulness will cover the last 5 or 10 where I just kind of did what I wanted to. That's not the way this works. That's Ezekiel 18, by the way, in-depth discussion of that. That it doesn't matter if a person is righteous and then he turns wicked at the end, he's a wicked man. It doesn't matter if a person is wicked and turns righteous at the very end, he's a righteous man. It's how you finish the race that ends up mattering. And so Solomon ends up falling, had the greatest potential. And you remember we talked about with him, one of the things that was interesting was that he did not have a prophet that was like a companion or a friend in his life the way that David did. David had Nathan. He also had Gad, I think that's right, and maybe another. And so David, even though he stepped over the line, he had people that would call his hand on it. Okay? Solomon didn't have anybody that would call his hand on something. We could go through countless illustrations of both organizations and people who had tremendous ability, but their growth did not keep pace with their influence. Okay? So one of the things you have to be concerned about is this, especially when you're developing people. in leadership positions. You have to be concerned about, number one, that their personal growth is moving at a faster rate than their level of influence. Because if the level of influence exceeds their growth rate, they're not spiritually strong enough to handle all of the acclaim and all of the good things that come along with being successful in that particular area. And so morally, they're not equipped to handle it, and they end up making huge mistakes. Or if you build yourself, you insert yourself in a place where nobody has the right to challenge you. I can think of one right now. A man was a well-known apologist. I loved the way he defended the Christian faith, respected the fire out of him. And it came out when after he was dead, that he had been a wildly immoral man. And there was an independent firm that was brought in to investigate everything that went on, and I read their findings because I was very interested to see what happened. And one of the major things of their findings was this: he surrounded himself with family, and anyone who ever questioned him was dismissed. He only surrounded himself with people who would not question him and would just worship him. That's not good. To surround ourselves with people who will only agree with us. To surround ourselves and to expect people that unless you tell me what I like, I don't want you around me. That's just not good for any of us. And Solomon, I think, is a prime example of that. He was blessed by God with wisdom and wealth and all different things, but he didn't have anybody that would call his hand on stuff, that didn't look at him and say, hey, you might want to rethink what you just did or what you just said. And so it ends up being not good for him. So the greatest king of Israel up to that point ends up a disaster at the end of his life. Then we move to the kingdoms dividing. In 12, that's where the division takes place. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the kingdom is taken from him. 10 tribes go north with Jeroboam. And the reason we have chapter 12 and verse 1 all the way through chapter 14 and verse 20 is because in chapter 13, at the end of chapter 12, Jeroboam sets up calf worship. And then in 13, the young prophet that we don't know his name, who ends up dying himself because of his disobedience, he pronounces judgment on calf worship, and then Jeroboam's reign is found in the rest of chapter 14. So kind of that whole section embodies the split that took place in Israel. Which, by the way, let me say this too. So we were, I guess yesterday, I was in class and we were talking, and my professor is, his PhD is in Old Testament, but it's more toward, the specialty of his PhD is toward structural analysis. That is how books are put together, okay? So many people look at people, it's interesting to see some people say, the people who wrote the Bible were primitive and ignorant. Let me explain it. You understand the structure and the way they wrote, that is the most asinine thought on this planet. The way they piece their arguments together is brilliant in ways that, you want to know why 666 has given us so much trouble in interpreting Revelation? Because we don't understand how ancient languages worked. Ancient languages, you not only had your letters, but those letters were assigned numerical value. So for an example, in Matthew 1, when you have 14 generations and 14 generations and 14 generations, why is it just 14 generations and 14 generations and then another 14 generations? Well, when you look at the Hebrew word David, its numerical value is 14. What Matthew is doing is saying, here's the new David. They're brilliant in everything that they do. And so what we're trying to do when we're going through this is we're trying to see what it is, the point that they're making, how they are piecing their arguments together. and then how that turns out to affect other things, okay? So after they split, then we're given a look at some of the kings of Judah, okay? So we look at Rehoboam, at Abijam, and Asa, those three kings in Judah, and then we're looking at the kings of Israel from chapter 15 through the end of chapter 16. As a matter of fact, actually, the kings of Israel on through where we just studied. And so the kingdom divides, it solidifies in that particular movement. All right, then we get into the kings versus prophets, and you have Elijah's announcement of judgment on Israel. There's going to be a famine, a drought, and of course that happens, and you have him confronting the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, chapter 18. And then Elijah has to go on a retreat in 19. You remember his spiritual discouragement. We spend a large amount of time on that. And then in chapter 20, an anonymous prophet, we don't know who he is, he announces judgment on Ahab because he didn't finish the job. He was supposed to kill Ben-Hadad, and he did not. He let him go. And so for that reason, Ahab was judged. And then you also have Elijah announcing judgment on Ahab in 21 for Naboth's vineyard, taking it from him. And then in chapter 22, you have Micaiah announcing judgment on Ahab as well. Okay? And Ahab ends up dying, by the way, at the end of 22, as he had said. All right? A little bit further, when we get into 2 Kings, Elijah announces judgment on Ahaziah, who is also a descendant of Ahab. And you remember he sought advice from a foreign god about whether he would recover from an illness. And he ends up dying in the process. And then in chapter 2, the first half of it anyway, Elijah is translated into heaven, and then Elisha takes over. He succeeds him. We went through that in great detail, where Elisha takes the steps, basically retraces the steps of Elijah to kind of confirm his prophetic role as the new Elijah. Then Elisha and Jehoram in chapter 3, you remember they're going to war and they haven't won, and then the king sacrifices his child and Israel just retreats. And we talked about how chapter 3, I think we spent a great portion of the class talking about the peculiarity of chapter 3. It's just a little different. It's not exactly easy to see what we're supposed to draw from it. Then we got the section of Elisha's miracles, and then you have Elisha and Ben-Hadad once again in chapter 6. You remember Elisha is giving the information, and Ben-Hadad goes and surrounds his city and so forth. And then you have Elisha and the Israelite king. That is Elisha. That's almost where we left off. Elisha predicts that Jerusalem has been surrounded, or Samaria has been surrounded, and Elisha predicts that will end very soon. That ends up happening, of course, with the lepers, figuring that out. And then you have, as we closed last week, beginning in 16, we're looking at kings of Judah again. Whereas from chapter 15 all the way through chapter 8 and verse 15, we've talked nothing but about the kings of Israel. And now we're back to the kings of Judah. And we look at two of them here, Jehoram and Ahaziah. Now, but the only reason they're brought up, okay, is because they are starting to behave like Israel, the 10 northern tribes. So that's why they're brought up. They intermarry with Ahab's family. And so, what is going on then? Okay? That's kind of a brief synopsis of where we've been. Now let's pay attention to a little bit more of the details. So, the title of our study is The Rise and the Ruin of Israel. Okay? How it rose, and then it's kind of like climbing a mountain. It's always hard to go up, but it's a whole lot easier to go down, especially if you trip. You're going to fall the whole way. You're going to roll the whole way. And that's basically what happens. And we're going to look at some things and some examples of how that happened at this point. So they start rising. As we said, David expanded the borders in 2 Samuel. That's what it's about. As he becomes king, he accelerates their growth. And then Solomon, in his diplomacy, his administration, he puts Israel at the highest point. Okay? They were, you could say, the world's superpower at that moment. Nobody was superior to them. and how quickly that will change, okay? So the road to ruin begins like this. It begins in idolatry. Now, it's easy to kind of get lost. I understand very well. It's easy to get lost when we're studying and say, it's another king, he had an idol, he did this, he didn't do this. What has it got to do with anything? That's where we have to start flying a little bit higher above the text and start looking for major points of interest, okay? Maybe not even reading the text, just looking at the chapter heading and thinking what went on and how does this all start putting together and what themes are flowing through these things. And the first one is idolatry. So Solomon introduces idolatry. They're not having any problem with it before that, okay? They're not having any problem with idolatry before that. Then you have Jeroboam at the end of chapter 12 when the kingdom divides. He implements calf worship. So it goes from Solomon just doing something for his wives and their temple to now you've got the kingdom broken in two, and that kingdom has set up a national religion that's antagonistic toward the God of Israel. Okay? Now, where we've spent a great deal of time looking at the house of Ahab, they've instituted Baal worship. It's gone a step further. Okay? So their idolatry, they're taking progressions in their idolatry. Okay? That's the thing. Ultimate falls into sin never happen like this. They're slow. They're progressive. They're half steps. They're three-quarter steps. They're a full step. Maybe take a step back. Then a couple steps more forward. That's the way it works. It's progressive in its nature. And I had a teacher a long time ago who used to tell us quite a bit. He said, Satan does not care if it takes him 20 minutes to get you or the next 60 years of your life, as long as he gets you. And if over that 60 years he can get you to take half steps and whole steps in the wrong direction and get your conscience to where it doesn't bother you to take those half steps or those whole steps, and you get comfortable with your new normal, he'll be patient. He's extremely patient. He'll wait for you. And then he'll give you some free time and you'll feel like, hey, this is, I'm okay. And then he'll move you another step down until he ends up leading you astray at the very end and you don't even realize it. And it's something that all of us have to take seriously. There's nobody that's immune from that, not a single person. All right, so there's idolatry. That was their problem. Then they rejected God's word. They weren't listening to him anymore. Okay? They had replaced him and set up idols, and now they're just not listening to him. Okay? So, a couple of ideas here. So, in 1 Kings 18, Elijah, God makes this great display, and the fire consumes the offering, and all the people say, the Lord, he is God. And so it seems like they're fixing to turn a corner. They're going to make it right. Except they don't. God made a grand display, and they didn't change a thing. Then you got Ahab and Ben-Hadad. God tells him, kill him. He lets him go. God says, don't go to war with Syria. They went to war with Syria. Then they start seeking advice from foreign deities. So it's gone from, okay, we're going to hear what God says, we're going to see displays, but we're not going to listen to him. Now we're just going somewhere else completely different to get our advice from. They didn't finish the job that Elisha sent them to do in chapter 3 to kill that particular king. They didn't listen about Elisha's prophecy concerning the fact that they would survive the besieging and the starving that they were facing. They're just not listening to him anymore. But I don't think they're the only people that ever did that. Don't we have a tendency to do that? Maybe I'm the only one then? we have to keep a constant watch over ourselves. There's a particular area that I struggle with in Christianity that's not natural for me. It's not natural for me. But it's one of the most fundamental things that Jesus expects us to do. And I find myself when I was looking over the conference I'm going to this week, and I was looking at the subjects on it, and I caught myself saying, this was the subject, there was a particular lecture that's going to be on that particular subject. And I thought, yeah, I'll probably sneak out and do some schoolwork doing that. And then I thought, but that's the one I need to hear. Progressively, you can stop listening. And before you realize it, you've drifted so far away that at that point, then, you're not going to listen to anything anymore. It doesn't even register on your radar. Yes, ma'am. I think that's probably closer. That's my first reaction is that he was the wisest man on the earth. He kind of stepped. I mean, there were other prophets because one tells him that the kingdom is taken from him in 11. But, you know, he is spiritually gifted with knowledge too. And so that can also lead you to the idea of God made me the wisest man on the earth, and he said, nobody's ever going to rise before me or after me that's smarter than I am. I think I know a little bit more than you do about this. So you could kind of get into some spiritual arrogance there to where you don't really listen to the other person. So I think it's possible, certainly. All right. The next area that they went into was violence. I might have jammed, Miss Debbie, I might have jammed the clicker. And there it is. Okay. So they begin to resort to violence. They start trying to kill Elijah. Ahab and Jezebel do. Then they kill the prophets. In 1 Kings 18, Obadiah has hidden 100 of them, but they've killed plenty more. Naboth's vineyard, they're willing to kill to take what they want. They start devaluing human life. Listen, this is Romans 1. Romans 1 is such an amazing commentary on what happens when you reject God. And it follows, by the way, the same pattern that we're seeing right here in Kings. You exchange God in idolatry. Their foolish hearts became darkened. They refused to listen. And then they began to do all manner of evil, including violence. That's Romans 1. That's 1st and 2nd Kings. When we replace God as supreme, and when we stop listening to him, we're going to go into all kinds of things that God has zero tolerance for. Because it's a progressive rejection. It's not an all-out rejection. I have rarely ever met a person who fell away that got up one morning and said, you know, I think I'm done today. But I have sat with a lot of people with tears in their eyes asking, how did I get here? How did I get here? And then we spend time trying to trace how they got there. So, we won't go into this why it matters tonight. We'll pick it up in a couple of weeks. But I can understand that when we get in the Old Testament, we get in some of these details, you can kind of go cross-eyed and think, what's the purpose? But here's the thing. Until you look at the details, you can't take the step back and see the big picture. And then, when you do that, that's when God starts laying your heart open. And he starts demanding that you examine yourself in light of what you know. And so that's one of the main reasons why this matters. But we'll pick up with that and move into chapter 9 in a couple of weeks.